I'd like to welcome everyone here this evening for yet another of our fabulous series of lectures associated with the 250th anniversary of Brown University. This tonight, like other times, we have gotten together with another unit on the Brown campus, in this case the School of Education, and to partner in presenting a lecture on one of the thematic ideas relevant to the year that Brown was founded, 1764. I would also like to emphasize that this is an ongoing series of talks that is going to continue in about a month's time with a talk by Colin Calloway from Dartmouth College on natives and empires. That will be jointly sponsored by the Hoffenreffer Museum of Anthropology. And then we have 3 more lectures in 2015, one February 17th on religion with Catherine Breckes of the Harvard Divinity School, on March 3rd with Charles Rosenberg of Harvard University, jointly sponsored by the School of Public Health, and the theme of that will be health and medicine. And then on May 23rd, 2015, let's see if I can pick at random somebody to speak. How about you, Gordon? Would you be willing to speak on that day? Okay, well then that'll be. You heard it first here, Gordon Wood, on politics and governance in 1764, co-sponsored by the Watson Institute for International Studies. This whole series was masterfully put together by Lynn Fisher from the Department of History and Margot Nishimura, and we owe it to them really for just putting together a spectacular series thus far, and that I have no doubt is going to continue. It is my pleasure to introduce Kenneth Wong, who is the chair of the School of Education. Is it a department or a school? Department of Education. When I was here at Brown, I actually took a course, a very popular course with Ted Sizer, going to high school in America. So I know that the education department focuses a lot on very contemporary issues and is really a leader in the field of high school education, secondary education in this country. All the more reason why I think it's a wonderful coming together of what the JCB offers to the Brown community and a great collaboration with the Department of Education to talk about what those issues looked like 250 years ago. So with that, I'll turn it over to Ken, who will introduce our night speaker.
Thank you very much, Neil, and what a wonderful pleasure to work with JCB and the History Department, and I would like to thank Lynn and Margot for spearheading this initiative. I think this is a wonderful lecture series, and we are in the Education Department are very, very pleased to be part of this as a co-sponsoring entity tonight. And it is my wonderful, great pleasure to introduce today's distinguished speaker. Professor George Marsden is a renowned expert on the history of Christianity in America. He holds degrees from Haverford College and Westminster Theological Seminary and earned a PhD from Yale University. He has taught at Calvin College and Duke University, and since 1992 has been awarded a distinguished professorship in history at the University of Notre Dame, and he is currently Professor of History Emeritus. Professor Marsden has also received fellowships and awards from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Pew Freedom Trust, and the John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Foundation. Professor Marsden is author or editor of more than a dozen books, more than 60 articles and book chapters, among other publications. His areas of expertise include, among others, the history and present state of fundamentalism in America and the culture of American university education. He once served as an expert witness testifying against the Arkansas creation science law. Professor Marsden's recent publications on these various topics include the award-winning book, Jonathan Edwards, A Life. His other major publications include Religion and American Culture, Understanding Fundamentalism and Evangelicalism, The Soul of American University, I might add that that's my favorite, and The Outrageous Idea of Christian Scholarship. The title of Professor Marsden's presentation today is The Old Learning, the New Light, and the Enlightenment. Professor Marsden.
Thank you so much, and it really is a genuine honor for me to be part of this distinguished series. As my title suggests, what I want to do this evening is to consider what collegiate education meant in Rhode Island in 1764 by looking at three major international contexts that shaped that meaning. These are the old learning, or the classics, the new light, or the revivalist branch of the Reformed or Calvinistic movement, of which the college founders were a part, and the newer learning that we associate with the Enlightenment. These three traditions continued to shape Brown's history through its first century. Before getting to those educational ideals, I want to say something about getting back to the mindset of 1764, thinking about what it was like to be in the colonies before the Revolution. And the biography I did of Jonathan Edwards, that to me was one of the most interesting parts of it, to think what it was like to be in New England when Northampton was on the frontier, and there were Indians everywhere, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. One of the things you need to do is try to imagine what the world looked like to these people. And that's a different question than the one we normally sort of instinctively ask, what do these people look like to us? And that's a legitimate question, and inevitably we're going to ask it. What does it look like to us, and how do we evaluate them? But first of all, it's important to think about how the world looked to them. And for Rhode Island in 1764, one of the things that comes up in just about every one of these lectures, I think, is the presence of slavery. That, to us, is the elephant in the room, and we rightly have immense difficulty in our moral imaginations, thinking, how can people who otherwise seem, not so bad, nonetheless can have such a blind spot to what looks like us to be such a self-evident and unjust system. Even 20 years later, after the American Revolution, 1784, many people here would be beginning to see what we see as self-evident, that the rights of men extend to Africans. But in 1764, that hadn't happened yet for a lot of people. And so to enter the world and their categories takes a good bit of imagination. And so I see one of the things that historians should be trying to do is something like what a novelist tries to do, try to enter imaginatively into the thought processes of another time. Now, realizing that most people in 1764 had this blind spot regarding slavery, can point us toward recognizing a fundamental feature of that society, of how just about everybody viewed human societies at that time. Everything was hierarchical. This was self-evidently built into the scheme of things, and it was reinforced by almost all of history and experience. It's just common sense. There were monarchs at the top and slaves at the bottom, and every rank in society in between. And people's significant relationships were likely to be vertical rather than horizontal. Fathers were the heads of the household and the authority. Women, children, hired servants, indentured, and slaves were all dependent on the persons directly above them. Paternalism was considered to be a great virtue, not a term of opprobrium. Even gentlemen were dependent on those above them from the king on down. Now, in 1764, there were some cracks beginning to appear in the hierarchical edifice. And to say a decade later that all men are created equal would ring true to a lot of people in the colonies, where there were few inherited nobility and a great deal of social mobility. Yet, whatever cracks there were in the edifice, hierarchy was the way everyone thought of social relationships. Now, I start with hierarchy because ideas of what education meant in the 1760s fit this hierarchical framework. And particularly that was the case for the first of these educational traditions or ideals that I suggest in my title as the old learning. What was the first thing that people thought about in collegiate education in 1764? And we go around the room here, you get the answer. It's the classical languages. It's the requirement to get into college. It didn't have to do with age, but rather with proficiency in the languages, in Latin and Greek. Mastering the classics, that had been what education just was since universities were begun in the Middle Ages. And so if you look at the curriculum at Brown in its early decades, Latin and Greek dominated, and as you'll have on your seat is the curriculum in 1783 is on the left side of your page there, and you can see particularly the first 2 years are dedicated largely to the classical languages. Collegiate education was designed to primarily to prepare people for professions, to be clergy or magistrates, and the men who became experts in these languages were gentlemen. They became the leading figures in the community to whom deference would be given. And one of the ways that women were subordinated was women didn't go to college. Women were not given this intensive training in the classics, and that was one of the things that differentiated educated women from educated men from women who might be well educated on their own, but not in that expertise. And so at graduation ceremonies, there were Latin orations, Latin syllogistic disputations that were signaling we stand in a long tradition of learning, and to be expert in the classics was to be part of an international community, that Latin was still the common language of the Western world. And so it tied you to not only people in the rest of the Western world, but also to a lot of people through time. There was a common core of texts that educated people were supposed to know. It also made possible that polymaths of the era could know just about everything important that there was to know, such as Thomas Jefferson graduated from William and Mary in 1762, would be one of them, and I'm sure you all know or have heard that President Kennedy's welcome to the Nobel Prize winners of 1962, when he said, I think this is the most extraordinary collection of talent, of human knowledge that has ever gathered together in the White House, with the possible exception of when Thomas Jefferson dined alone. And if one might be tempted to think that learning Latin and Greek was just a pedantic exercise for these revolutionary gentlemen, for one thing, you look at their architecture, such as Jefferson, but much more basically, the classics provided their lessons in history. They saw history as showing patterns that were repeated patterns. So, for instance, one of the repeated patterns that they we're quite sure about is that republics, when they turn into empires, that leads to corruption in high places. And as Gordon Wood has been teaching us for a long time, that was part of that formed the lens through which the revolutionaries perceived what was going on in the British Empire after the French and Indian War. That the taxes, which from British point of view seemed fairly reasonable, appeared to them to be demonstrating a pattern of tyranny. And if you read the Declaration of Independence, after there's this long list that demonstrates this is a pattern of tyranny. Well, that lens is shaped by their classical learning, or when James Madison is defending the U.S. Constitution, one of the people signing himself as Publius, and arguing how can we have a large republic without one group tyrannizing the other? That's all based on trying to draw the lessons from classical history, and then we're forming the American Republic as a new order for the ages, but one based on these classical models, and you have all sorts of classical mottos and the like. And British colonials, despite their hierarchical assumptions, could be easily turned into revolutionaries because, in practice here, of the social mobility that so many of them experienced. And in fact, learning the classical languages could be an avenue toward social mobility. One of the best examples that I happen to know about is the Reverend Ezra Stiles, whom you all, I'm sure, know about, who was the most learned man in Newport in 1764, was the beneficiary of such mobility. His grandfather was an ordinary farmer, and I happen to know about this because the grandfather was from East Windsor, Connecticut, where Jonathan Edwards' father was the minister. Jonathan Edwards' father saw this grandfather had talent, prepped him in Greek and Latin, got him to Yale in his early 20s, and then one of his sons, by the 1770s, Ezra Stiles had become the president of Yale. Ezra Stiles, as you may know, is just one of these most remarkable people, and there's a great biography of him, The Gentle Puritan by Edmund Morgan, my mentor. And it's a book that, if you haven't read, particularly if you're around here, you should read. The other book to read is biography is Catherine Breckis's book on Sarah Osborne, which you'll be here in this series. So anyway, acquiring expertise in the classical language was a source for gaining prestige, not only for individuals, but for larger movements. And so that brings us to our second context for understanding the significance of collegiate education for the founders of the College of Rhode Island in 1764. The founders, as is well known, were principally Baptists. And although the charter proclaimed there would be no religious tests, that was a provision that applied for students, not for faculty or the governing board. The latter specifically was to be controlled by Baptists, which is the issue that Ezra Stiles ran afoul of. He wanted to start a college in Rhode Island, but then it came to be perceived that he wanted it to be run by Presbyterians such as himself, not by Baptists. The impetus for founding a Baptist college came from the Philadelphia Baptist Association. And the Philadelphia Baptist Association was part of the Reformed or Calvinist branch of Baptists. The Philadelphia Association adopted the Philadelphia Confession, which is essentially the same as the Westminster Confession of Faith, which was the basis for Presbyterian and Congregationalist faith drawn up in the 1600s. Presumably, the Philadelphia Baptists looked here to Rhode Island as a place to found the college because there were a lot of Baptists here, and particularly because there were a lot of rich Baptists. So the educational ideals of Philadelphia Baptists and their Rhode Island affiliates were very much shaped by the ideals of the international Reformed or Calvinistic movement. This was an extremely energetic movement that's been going on since the 1500s that was designed to remake Christendom. It was an international revolutionary movement, if you will. It was particularly strong in Presbyterian Scotland, but also had a substantial strength in the Dutch Reformed, Hungarian Reformed, German Reformed. French Huguenots were driven out of France. And in England, the movement had reached its peak under Oliver Cromwell in the English Civil Wars in the mid 1700s. And after that, when the Reformed were defeated, they became dissenters in the English tradition, and most of the colonies were settled by people from these dissenting traditions, and it was these dissenters who were the ones who were using classical history to challenge monarchical power, because they were out of power as far as their religion was concerned. Education played a very prominent role in this Reformed movement, because if the design was to refashion Christendom under right principles, then they took great care to have educated leaders who could point out what those principles were. Roman Catholics criticized the Reformation, saying, you go to the Bible alone and there'll be total anarchy. And the answer to that in the Reformed tradition was, no, we need to have all clergy be well trained in the classical languages, to be experts who can get together and make true decisions as to what exactly the Bible says. And you can see the importance of education here in New England from these Reformed settlers from the beginning of Massachusetts Bay Colony. They had one of the highest number of university-educated people concentrated in anywhere in the world. The highest rate of literacy, including women, than most anywhere else in Christendom. One of the very first things they did was to found Harvard College in 1736, and by 1764, the Reformed could also point to Yale College and the College of New Jersey at Princeton as leading colonial institutions. Now, the Baptists who were Reformed, such as the Philadelphia Baptists and the like, were poor relations in all this. Roger Williams had been a university man, but he questioned the whole idea of reconstituting Christendom. And most famously, he advocated separation of church and state, that he questioned the whole idea that there could be a Christian state governed by church principles. For him, a true church was a body of truly converted believers who separated themselves from the inevitably corrupt world. Becoming a Baptist, or one who limited baptism to adults only, was to believe, only believers should be baptized. And that was the logical corollary of having a separated church, of a believer's church. So not only was Williams in exile, he was also not into civilization building in the same way that his other Reformed colleagues were. So higher education was not an immediate priority in Rhode Island. But Baptist interest in higher education grew in the 18th century as the movement began to spread, and there were substantial numbers of Baptists, and inevitably that spread of the Baptist movement led to economic success among some of the Baptists and interest in cultural leadership. And so once those two conditions were met, there are lots of Baptists and some of them are well-to-do, the idea of getting first-rate education suddenly became very attractive for the movement. It was a source for prestige in the movement. So you get someone like Isaac Backus, who was the most effective Baptist leader, not a college-educated person himself, but nonetheless was on board among the trustees for founding the college here. It's a way of upgrading this reform movement and getting it up to the standards that they were seeing around them at Harvard, Yale, and Princeton. Now, up to now, I've been talking about this movement as Reformed or Calvinistic, and that might be a more accurate title for the second tradition I'm talking about. But I'm calling it New Light, in part because that just fits the title better of Old Learning, New Light, and Enlightenment, but also because these Baptists were part of extremely important new 18th century movement, the New Light revivalist movement that was reshaping much of Protestantism. And that is what we call the Great Awakening. It's part of an international revival that has counterparts in Europe and in England, the Methodist movement. But here it's particularly associated with the British Reformed evangelist George Whitefield. It marks the origins of what we call today the evangelical movement. Awakeners emphasized heartfelt religious conversion, and they emphasized the authority of the Bible. Now, most Baptists were already teaching these things, but one of the results of the awakening was that it appeared that it made the Baptists, the churches who embraced the awakening, they were growing suddenly, and many people who were converted took up the logic of conversion to say, if you're converted, well, then the church should be, the baptism should be a sign of your own decision and not something that's just passed on from generation to generation. The Reverend James Manning was deeply shaped by this New Light movement. He had just graduated from the College of New Jersey, which was at Princeton, which was the New Light college, in contrast to Harvard and Yale, which were decidedly Old Light, anti-awakening colleges. Manning had come to Princeton just after Jonathan Edwards had come there in 1757, died in early 1758. I think Manning must have come there later in 1758, but Edwards was there as one of the shapers of, he was the intellectual leader of the New Light revivalist tradition. And Edwards' son-in-law, the Reverend Aaron Burr, had actually preceded Edwards as president at Princeton. And Aaron Burr, who was the father of the later vice president, Aaron Burr was very much a New Light evangelist. First thing he did when Nassau Hall was built in Princeton was to conduct a revival that was the model for collegiate revival. And so Manning was educated in a place of where New Light revivalists ran things. The next two presidents after Burr and Edwards, Samuel Davies and Samuel Findlay, were also Presbyterian New Light revivalists. So these were Manning's models for college presidents. And you can see the imprint of Princeton or College of New Jersey everywhere in the College of Rhode Island, that Manning adopted the Princeton curriculum as his curriculum. If you look at the architecture of the two schools, if you look at the early pictures of University Hall and then look at the picture of Nassau Hall, looks like almost the same picture reversed. And see it in that, you can look in that case afterward. The early College of Rhode Island prided itself on being non-sectarian so far as students were concerned, but nonetheless, evangelical religion was a very conspicuous presence, ensuring as much as possible that education took place in the context of piety. So chapel was required twice a day, and students were expected to attend a local congregation on Sundays unless they were Seventh-day Baptists or Jews. Specifically, Christian teachings, as such, you don't find much in the evidence of those in the curriculum, except they're studying New Testament Greek, and they're also, in the junior year, they're studying Doddridge's lectures in Preaching, which is a brief book by a Scottish educator and preacher. But nonetheless, the fact that many of the courses were taught by the president, who was a Baptist clergyman, made sure that there was a context of piety for what education would mean. In 1764, there doesn't seem to be a strong sense that that there was a need to present Christian education as opposed to secular learning, as you might find in some Christian colleges today. Rather, the assumption was that collegiate education has been long been true in Christendom, that there was a unity of all knowledge, that God was the author of all truth, and therefore all truth would harmonize. So what was learned through natural reason and what might be learned from the Bible in chapel, taught in chapel or in a Sunday service, those would be complementary. There's no sense of tension between them. And that was the assumption, after all, that made it possible for Christendom to embrace the classics as part of the curriculum. The two things were complementary to each other, not in contrast or in opposition to each other. And so for the same reason, there was an assumption that all modern knowledge would also harmonize with biblical knowledge properly understood. That brings us to our third theme and the third context for what education meant in 1764, and that's what we call the Enlightenment. Here is another international movement fostered by the scientific revolution and the new learning generally, that had revolutionized the Western world and eventually the whole world. Though 18th century people sometimes refer to their era as the Age of Lights, the term Enlightenment was a later invention. And one important point is because we tend to associate, or a lot of people tend to associate the Enlightenment with the French Revolution, there's a tendency to think of Enlightenment learning as essentially secular or even as anti-Christian. But for the same reasons I was just talking about, the founders of the College of Rhode Island wouldn't have thought of it that way. They didn't see the new learning as a threat. Some of them knew about Voltaire or David Hume or the like, but they assumed the new science and the new learning would harmonize with the Christian faith. And most of their sources for the new learning were mediated through distinctly Christian writers. Primary source for much of the learning at this time was Scotland. Scotland was predominantly Presbyterian and so fit with the dissenter outlook that was dominant here in the colonies. And not only was there considerable Scottish immigration to the colonies, but some of the most important educators in the 1700s were Scottish. So the new learning in America was mediated primarily through what we've come to now call the Scottish Enlightenment. And the Scottish Enlightenment, the influence was so great that provides a basis for, I think, a pretty convincing argument. It's a book by Arthur Herman called, with a bit of exaggeration, How the Scots Invented the Modern World. And I'd recommend this book as a very accessible read if you're interested in that sort of thing. And a good part of the argument rests on the Scottish influence on the colonies, which were, in the United States, became the first modern nation. And at the time of the American Revolution, sometimes it was called a Presbyterian rebellion. The most significant evidence of the connection of the Scots with this New Light movement is that in 1768, John Witherspoon arrived at the College of New Jersey to be its president. And Witherspoon became easily the most influential college president of his era. He was also the only clergyman to be a signer of the Declaration of Independence. He taught some of the important revolutionaries, James Madison, Aaron Burr Jr. The Scottish Enlightenment centered on moral philosophy, and Witherspoon himself was a significant moral philosopher. One of the things he did at Princeton was to introduce the two-volume text of the leading Scottish moral philosopher Francis Hutcheson. Hutcheson was a more moderate, broad-minded Presbyterian than Witherspoon. Witherspoon was a more evangelical Calvinist. But the principles of moral philosophy were supposed to be not sectarian. In fact, not being sectarian, you could say, was the essence of the project of moral philosophy. The idea was to get beyond religiously based arguments to a universal system of morals founded on self-evident first principles. So Hutcheson taught that the Creator had endowed humans with an empirical ability to recognize right and wrong, that is, the moral sense. So, for instance, we all have a native ability to recognize justice or injustice, or we all admire wonderful acts of charity, even though we don't always do them ourselves. We all admire them, or we admire loyalty to family, loyalty to friends, and the like. These things are all based on a common sense intuition and don't need any further demonstration to demonstrate them. And so the idea is that the system of morality can be built on firm foundations that are essentially empirical, and then all we need to do is to be able to follow the judgments of what our common sense has led us to. Well, and you can see this in the Declaration of Independence. I think it's it's reflected a bit in, we hold these truths to be self-evident. There are self-evident common sense principles, and common sense is, of course, a watchword of the revolution. And not surprisingly, when we do get the details of the curriculum here at Brown in 1783, there on it you'll find Hutcheson's 2 volumes of moral philosophy. Essentially, if you look at that curriculum, it moves from the study of the classics in the first 2 years to some more modern subjects in the last 2 years. John Locke's essay on understanding, which is some of the background to the moral philosophy movement, is there in the curriculum. In addition, in the beginning of the junior year, there's a study of more practical subjects, some basic math, some practical scientific studies, surveying, navigation, astronomy, general science. Joyce Chaplin, in her earlier lecture here, which I listened to looked at, was a marvelous lecture, has underscored the fascination with scientific instruments and the like. So, as I suggested before, this scientific study fit very comfortably with the rest of the curriculum. It wasn't a clash between having that and studying principles of preaching in the junior in your junior year. They took for granted that all knowledge would harmonize. At Princeton, John Witherspoon's inaugural address was entitled The Unity of Piety and Science, the unity of piety and science. And that could have been the motto for early Brown as well. It could be seen as the theme of this lecture. What brings these three things together? It's the unity of piety and science. Finally, I want to remark on how these 3 international ideals that shape what does education mean in the 1760s and the 70s, that they didn't fade away with the coming of the new republic, but rather they became the standard for mainstream collegiate education in America for the next century, up until the Civil War. And this is important here because Brown University became a leading purveyor of these ideals as the model for higher education in the 19th century. So if John Witherspoon was the leading educator, college president of the revolutionary generation, the leading person of the mid-19th century was Francis Wayland, who resided here from 1827 to 1855. And I think despite being several generations apart, Witherspoon and Wayland, or you can substitute Manning and Wayland, they would have found much more in common than they find differences between each others. Wayland, like Witherspoon or Manning, was an evangelical clergyman in the Reformed tradition. He, like other educators of his day, followed Witherspoon's example of seeing education as serving the Republic, promoting both the religion and the good order in the body politics. Wayland was especially notable in the mid-19th century as America's leading proponent of Scottish common sense philosophy. He, in fact, wrote the textbooks that were read at a lot of other colleges, as elements of moral science, elements of political economy, elements of intellectual philosophy. He innovated in the curriculum, but only in the context of these given educational assumptions that were already in place. So if you look at Wayland's 1842 there on the other side of the page, that's his curriculum, and you'll see that scientific courses appear a bit earlier in his curriculum and more of them. The classics are still there, but they're a little less prominent, and especially significantly, he introduces what became characteristic of mid-19th century American collegiate education for the next generation, and that is that there would be a capstone course, sometimes it's called moral philosophy, taught by the president, that would tie everything together. And how does this all fit with a sort of Christian perspective on things? So one of the themes for Wayland's ideals of education would be the same as what Witherspoon talked about, the unity of piety and science. But in Wayland's curriculum, there's one innovation that I think represents a sign of a crack in this edifice. Seniors, you'll see, are also supposed to study Joseph Butler's Analogy and William Paley's Evidences. Now, these were two apologetic works designed to demonstrate the unity of piety and science. And my thinking is once you have to demonstrate something that was taken for granted, you're beginning to see some trouble there. The most famous argument in the demonstration is Paley's argument that if Robinson Crusoe found a watch on the beach, he could infer there was a watchmaker. But that was a very argument that at the same era Darwin is working on undermining. And even though Wayland would not have been aware of Darwin before 1859, nonetheless, there's a suggestion that you need to be proving Christianity to be true. And probably the essence of the problem is this, that all of these three traditions that I've been talking about assumed that there was a common natural law built into the scheme of things, that since there was a creator, whatever laws we discover, whether it's ancient, modern, or the Bible, they all will harmonize and you can find objective truth. And the Western world's on the verge of Darwin and Darwin's followers who used naturalistic evolutionary models for all thought to make it easy to believe that truth is relative to one's own time and location. And so even in Wayland's day before Darwinism, and in Wayland's day, evangelicalism was at its height in America and in American higher education. There was also the problem of that the old system of these harmony of these three traditions assumed that there was one unified system of truth and that was becoming more and more problematic in an increasingly diverse culture. It was one thing to argue that there's a unity of the Bible and common sense, but the question was becoming more and more apparent. Whose common sense, or whose Bible is for that matter, but whose common sense? Was it Protestant? Was it Catholic? Was it liberal? Was it conservative? Was it religious? Was it secular? And then at the same time, Wayland was a contemporary not only of Darwin, but also of Ralph Waldo Emerson. So what if rational common sense isn't really the avenue to truth? What if there are higher intuitions that every individual can appropriate? How can you hold to this unity of truth? So the whole edifice is cracking in a lot of ways, and Wayland's trying to hold it together in the evidences and in, if you read his moral philosophy, in that as well. And so the sequel is these intellectual forces which were converging, then combine after the Civil War with growing immigration, growing diversity, urbanization, industrialization, and so and the professionalization of the disciplines, so that by the end of the 19th century, this whole edifice is pretty much collapsed. So you can say that these three ideals that I've discussed prevailed in 1764. They were still there pretty much intact in 1864. But if you jump ahead to 1964, then you see that it just about vanished. So thank you.
I think we have time for a few questions. So, yeah, please.
Thank you, Professor, for reminding me that it's a good idea to read the Iliad as a freshman. But I actually have a question that's related to my favorite Scottish Enlightenment thinker, Adam Smith. I wondered if you could comment on how the Brown community would have reacted to the wealth of nations, given his opinions about the necessity of ending slavery for advancing the economy. Because as it was published in 1776.
Well, you're saying in 1776. Well, you know, by then you're beginning to get some people here who are saying such things. Samuel Hopkins, Edwards' disciple, and was beginning to move in that direction. So there's other people saying that, but by that time, and that accelerates, of course, in New England pretty quickly, I think. By Wayland's time, Wayland is pretty much, his economic views are drawn a lot, as I recall, on Adam Smith. That's one of the kinds of things that he sees as kind of a commonsensical way of showing how God has designed societies to make everything turn out for the best. Yeah.
I wanted to ask, I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about the influence of the New Lights on the creation of Brown University, and specifically the egalitarian notions of the revivalists. And I'm thinking about the inclusiveness of the New Lights, their willingness to include people of all races and men and women in their church, their focus on the conversion experience. How can we reconcile that with the hierarchy that you talked about and the kind of elitism?
Well, it's one of the things that is breaking down the hierarchy. I mean, if you start in 1764, the hierarchy is still there. It's Rip Van Winkle. By 30 years later, it's largely eroded, and most people say it's the Great Awakening. That's the first. This is going around and saying to people, don't listen to your authoritative preacher, challenge your preacher. So it's a people's movement, and so is the revolution. They're not necessarily dependent on each other, but they represent that same impulse that's there. So you certainly get that growing out of the evangelical, the revival movements, and Sarah Osborne's a good example of that. You'll hear about too. I mean, the women are speaking. That's one of the things Kathy Breckus has written about. Large numbers of women preachers in these new movements that just go out and do it. Yeah.
I have a question related to Isaac Backus, who you mentioned earlier. Of course, his papers are here at Brown and very involved in the early stages of the university. And at the same time he's gathering some of these strands together, he's also writing his Greek Baptist history, which is really something of a martyrology. And while he says, yes, Mass Bay was earnest but mistaken, right, he really does want to say there's something distinctive about the Baptist history and the Baptist view of the relation between church and institutions.
Mm-hmm.
So I wonder if you'd say more about his particular influence, or what's distinctively Baptist about those early years.
What's distinctively Baptist about the early year? I'm not sure I know that. That it looks as though they are, as I said, sort of buying into this Reformed reverence for education, and it's also for social mobility. And so the Baptist side of things isn't doing a whole lot, except maybe I expect there's the emphasis on tolerance for students. I think that's a bell that is in tune with Backus and the like, because he's a great champion of we don't, shouldn't be religious discrimination. So there might be tones there, I think. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I really appreciated the distinction and the importance of the thread between, on the one hand, religious thought and the Enlightenment and the scientific thought, and the attempts to reconcile that in the middle of the 18th century, and then how that gets played out beyond. It reminds me that already in the 1720s, Iberian thinkers such as the Benedictine friar Benito Jerónimo Feijó were already contending very much with how they dealt, how the incorporation of Newtonian thinking into a sort of cosmic worldview would affect Aristotelianism and the reliance upon that in 18th century Spain. And actually, sort of we're surrounded here, and I should have mentioned this when I welcomed everybody, with a fabulous exhibition, which I hope that during the reception, which I hope you'll stay for, you'll have a chance to take a look at, which is precisely showing the earlier traditions that were alive, beginning in 1551 with the establishment of universities in Lima and Mexico City, to this, the founding of Brown and other New England universities, as well as this image of Nassau and University Halls. So the question essentially is, did the founders of universities like Brown and some of the other New England thinkers look in any way to the Iberian models in trying to understand how it was that a kind of worldview that seemed to be so much at odds with a Newtonian model could possibly allow for both a religious and a scientific view at the same time?
I don't know about the Iberian model at all. I know from working on Edwards, who was going to college in the 20s, that already in his time, he was very aware the old Aristotelian, that was the old way of looking at things, and he had embraced the Newtonian system without any problem. And in fact, you can see his theology is a way, it's kind of a cosmic Newtonianism. Everything's related to everything in a world of persons. So I don't. I mean, my impression is, is that they were pretty comfortable with the Newtonianism and weren't seeing this as, what are we going to do to save the faith? It's more rather, well, here's more evidence of how God works, so it's not. It doesn't necessarily cause a conflict. Yeah, the back row. Yeah.
You know that James Manning, president of the first president of this college, one time went to Continental Congress as a member, but he was picked as a delegate to the Continental Congress in 1777 or something like that. Yeah. In order to get some money from the Congress, because the American soldiers really messed up this Brown, College of Rhode Island. But Baptists in Massachusetts really had a very anti-static, anti-mundane, anti-secular dispositions. I wonder that James Manning, who was very much involved in the establishment of the Warren Association, whatnot, for the separation of church and state, would go to Congress to get money for the Baptist college. I wonder how the Isaac Backus, people like, say, Isaac Backus or Hezekiah Smith would react to that. Because the Massachusetts Baptists are more very anarchical in many sense. You know, unto Caesar that belongs to Caesar, that you don't be contaminated corrupted by the association with the state. Now here is the James Manning, the president going to the Congress to obtain state aid for the sake of the college.
I think, separation of church and state, they were concerned for discrimination against particular religious groups, but it wasn't necessarily saying church and state shouldn't have anything to do with each other. Yeah, you're the expert.
I comment. He was elected to the Confederation Congress, not the Continental.
Yeah, Congress, Continental Congress.
No, Confederation Congress. In around 1784, 85. And he went there to try to get the government to basically pay for the use of the college. They had basically wrecked the building, left it with holes in the walls and torn out all the cupboards and the floorboards, and the Army had occupied the building. So basically what he's doing is asking them to pay rent and to pay for the damage they've done to the building. It's not a question of church and state here at all, not at all.
Well, I'm just wondering, he was also the leader of the Warren Association.
The college is not a church.
Where Warren Association was a very important Baptist organization.
I agree.
In New England.
This is the president of the college trying to go get the college fixed by the government for having used his college and left what, they only had one building, and they left it in complete ruins.
Yeah.
And that's all he's trying to do. This is not a case of trying to get government aid to help the church. This is trying to get the government to pay for the damage done to his college during the war.
Yeah, when he failed to do that, he quit the other job, you see, James Manning.
This is the way that we like seminars to end here, in an absolute disagreement over details, that the library can serve as a resource to resolve, ideally. And although the college may not be a church, Manning's building is now a chapel. But I don't think you can decide your own punchline. But in any case, just wanted to say thank you to Professor Marsden for a fabulous talk, and for after applauding him, I hope that you will very much join us for the reception. So thank you.